Thank you. Appreciate the invitation. Disclosures include the Diffuse studies, principal investigator of the ongoing Timeless study, which is sponsored by Genentech, and a Schema View, which is the company that purchased the Rapid software from Stanford University. So perfusion imaging-based IV thrombolysis. For us, the story began in the mid-1990s when we first started doing routine diffusion-weighted imaging on stroke patients and eventually had an NIH grant to do 4 diffusion imaging pictures on consecutive stroke patients. And what we could see is that growth was highly variable, and it wasn't linear. Here's an example of just a patient who had pretty stable diffusion lesion at 7 and 13 hours after symptom onset, and then there was significant growth between 13 and 28 hours. So the question is, if you just have the first picture, how do you know how big it's going to be? And the answer seemed to be perfusion imaging. We saw that there were 3 different perfusion patterns that are well known: the mismatch pattern, the matched pattern indicating the infarct is likely completed, and then a pattern indicating that reperfusion has likely occurred, where the diffusion lesion is bigger than the perfusion lesion. So based on that, we wanted to do the first randomized trial of perfusion-based late window thrombolysis. We proposed this originally in 1998 to the NIH, but John Marler, who was our project officer and a major advocate of the very short time window for IV TPA, said, "You guys aren't ready to do this trial." But he supported the Diffuse study as a cohort. And if you look at what Diffuse stands for, it is to understand stroke evolution. And that's what we tried to do, particularly in the first 2 Diffuse trials, is to really understand how strokes evolve. What's the natural history with and without reperfusion therapy? And the result of all 3 Diffuse trials was this graph, which was published in a paper called The Late Window Paradox that came out with the Diffuse 3 trial. And what it indicates is that stroke evolution is completely different than what most of us were taught in medical school, that it's only about 20% of patients who have this very rapid malignant type growth, and actually half of stroke patients, at least half of stroke patients, have this very slow growth. And again, it's often not linear. Sometimes they don't grow at all for 5, 6, 10 hours, and then later they take off. This graph has been now reproduced by a number of groups, and here's one that you may not have heard yet because it's not published. Should be published relatively soon. It's called the FRAME study. This was presented last spring at ESOC. And what they did here is they did perfusion imaging, diffusion perfusion imaging, on all their consecutive early window thrombectomy patients, but they blinded the physicians. So the rapid was run, but the results were not available. So they could see how many patients who get treated with thrombectomy in the early time window actually have no mismatch. Is it the 20% that we showed in the curve? And their answer was yes. It's 20% of the patients who go to thrombectomy without a mismatch, a pattern suggesting a completed infarct, if you don't take a look. And obviously, it's not standard practice to take a look. And here's the results. You can see the patients who had a mismatch had a really robust benefit, 60 versus 30% in terms of good outcome rates, reperfusion versus non-reperfusion. But just as we had seen in Diffuse 1 and Diffuse 2, if you have a completed infarct, reperfusion doesn't make sense. And I think neurologists would know that reperfusing a completed infarct is not going to do you any favors. There's an absolute 10% less good outcome in the patients who have a completed infarct who go to thrombectomy in that 6-hour time window. So this is the explanation for why we see a more robust treatment effect in studies like Extend-IA or SWIFT Prime in the early time window than a study like Mr. Cleaner Thrace, because 80% of the patients are good candidates, 20% are probably completed infarcts. But when you mix in that smaller number of completed infarcts, right, it's only 18%, it's only going to dilute your benefit a little bit. So you'll still show an overall benefit when you treat all comers in an early time window. But this is the explanation for why you go to a late time window and you screen out those patients with rapid growth, that you get a more robust treatment effect. And that in all the studies that use perfusion imaging to select the patients, you see more robust treatment effects than in the studies that did not use perfusion imaging to select patients, whether that's early or late window. But what about this late window paradox? When we drill down really deeply to this, you can see that there are some disadvantages in the late window. So these are looking at patients who had the favorable target mismatch profile in SWIFT prime and extend IA and comparing them with the DAWN and diffuse 3 patients. And it's interesting to see that these patients have the same amount of mismatch. They've all got about 100 mLs of mismatch. They're the same age, same NIH stroke scale, and they had the same recanalization rates. But overall, even though the treatment effect is very robust in the late window, the good outcome rates are not as good in the late window as they are in the early window, where we're seeing close to 70% good outcomes in the endovascular arm versus 50% in the late window. So again, if you think that time doesn't matter and it's all about salvageable tissue, you might be wondering, why didn't we do as well in diffuse 3 and DAWN as we did in SWIFT prime and extend IA if we had the same amount of salvageable tissue? And I think one of the reasons for that is that there is the lack of the thrombolytic. So obviously late window trials didn't have the thrombolytic. If you added in a thrombolytic, would that rise the good outcome rates, both in the non-reperfused and the reperfused patients? So that brings us into some of the rationale for the ongoing late window perfusion-based thrombolysis trials. And this is an interesting field because we have been struggling at this for a long, long time. This is a summary of 12 trials that attempted to win this battle of showing a positive effect of IV thrombolysis beyond 4.5 hours. And as you know, these 12 trials failed because of the standard time as brain curve. These trials typically showed this curve showing that if you treat late, you get a much less robust treatment effect. But recently, there's been some news that changes that. We've got some trials that give us a lot of conviction that we can use IV thrombolysis in the late window if we treat the right patients. So the first trial that was positive is Wake Up, but this is actually not a late window trial. What the investigators tried to do was identify the early window patients in those who woke up with a stroke. So the flare DWI mismatch was to try to identify if you were really within 4.5 hours and you were a wake up. The only trial that has shown a positive benefit on their primary analysis in late window, true late window patients, is the Extend study that Bruce and his colleagues published last spring. 4.5 to 9 hour window, everybody selected with perfusion imaging, and it was a positive study. It becomes even more positive when you look at this meta-analysis that Bruce published last spring in Lancet, where he takes the additional patients from the EPITHET trial and from the ECAS-4 trial. Remember, ECAS-4 was not overall a positive trial. It was an eyeball-based perfusion diffusion mismatch trial, but Bruce ran all of these studies through RAPID using the same criteria that he used in Extend, and you can see you have a really very convincing statistical benefit when you look at the pooled analysis of all 3 of these trials if they had mismatch with automated perfusion imaging. What's really interesting is to look at the group of patients who didn't have mismatch, and I understand most of these came from ECAS-4. These were patients who, based on eyeball, seemed to have mismatch, but when you put them through the automated program, it said no, they don't meet the Extend criteria. And although the numbers are small here, so it's not statistically very robust, what you can see is what we've seen in the previous trials, like FRAME and Diffuse 1 and Diffuse 2. There was a trend toward doing worse in the reperfusion group. The alteplase group, if you look at death, it was 17% versus 4%, the 17% being alteplase, worse than placebo. Major disability, rank and 5, 8% versus 4%. So again, it's the idea that if you choose the wrong patient to reperfuse, you are not going to do them any favors. And that's the reason for using perfusion imaging if you're going to do late window IV thrombolysis. So can we do better than what was done in Extend? Here's the Extend results. And the answer is clearly yes, because one of the problems is that many of these patients in Extend had an LVO. And we all know that IV thrombolysis is not going to dissolve all of your LVOs. You're going to get much better recanalization if you take those patients to thrombectomy. So if we're going to do late window, we should have the thrombectomy in addition to the IV thrombolysis. And as Bruce has shown you very elegantly through this Extend IA TNK trial, which he just summarized, TNK is probably a better choice than TPA to do the late window thrombolysis. So that brings us to the Timeless trial, which is an ongoing study in the US and Canada. It's going to have about 90 sites. We use the lower dose of TNK that Bruce talked about, the 0.25. And the patients are all selected by penumbral imaging. So all of the sites are using rapid for the study. This is the type of patients we're looking for that has a small core and a large penumbra. They will get the TNK versus placebo typically prior to when they go to thrombectomy. This is the type of patients that we do not want, the type of patient that we think does not benefit from late window IV thrombolysis or thrombectomy. So superior division M2, where you can see it is a matched deficit, no mismatch. So here's the enrollment update. We're really excited about the speed of enrollment. This trial is really just getting off the ground. We still have 20 more centers that need to be activated, and we're already seeing a patient every other day. And we're on our way, I think, to getting at least a patient a day when we get the rest of the sites activated. So that's the good news. We have 76 patients in. We're moving quickly. We should be getting more than 350 a year when we're fully up to speed, so we should get the study done quick, which is important. The downside is you guys are doing so well with your rapid door to puncture times, it's giving us very little time for our needle to puncture. In other words, the TNK is not getting as much time in this study as it had in Bruce's Extend TNK trial that he told you about. So what we need to do, and this is a huge opportunity, I think, for everybody in the room, is to realize that this study is breaking new ground in being able to give the drug at the spoke site, randomize at the spoke site where you get the time for the drug to work on your way to your thrombectomy site. And this is going to be the way that many neuroprotective studies are done in the future. So I think a smart thing to do is get to know your spokes and figure out how you can get them to be partnering with you in your future trials, because there will be a lot of opportunities to show benefit by preventing the growth of the penumbra during transport to thrombectomy. So I'm going to end here and saying it's a really exciting time. I'm confident that late window IV thrombolysis works. It's already been demonstrated by the Extend group. I think we can push it even further with the ongoing late window trials. And that although time is still brain, I think it's time to time every brain to figure out how we can treat these patients most effectively. Thank you very much.